Now to that breaking news from the world of NASCAR. Overnight, an investigation launched after a noose was found at the Talladega Superspeedway in Alabama, apparently meant as a message to Bubba Wallace, the sport's only black full-time driver.
Now, this is a fascinating story about how race and racism is covered in the United States by the media. And it begins with a noose being discovered in the garage of Bubba Wallace. Bubba Wallace is the only black driver in NASCAR, which is one of America's top motorsports. The noose is a symbol and reminder of slavery, lynching, and segregation. And with that in mind, NASCAR reacted immediately by calling it a heinous act, and then quickly called the FBI, who sent in 15 agents. Now, the FBI discovered it was actually a rope for pulling down the garage door, and that it had been up for months, well before the garage was assigned to Bubba. It was not then, they determined, a crime. But by then, some in the media had already run with the story and offered it up as more evidence that America was deeply racist. In a moment, we'll hear from our panel, a NASCAR journalist, a NASCAR driver, and an African-American academic who wrote Hate Crime Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War. But first, a quick look at how the story unfolded.
The latest on NASCAR, which heads into another weekend of racing with no end to the controversy involving the only full-time black driver.
An incredible showing earlier this hour, a show of solidarity from NASCAR drivers and crew members for the only black driver currently in the top circuit, Bubba Wallace. Now, this comes after somebody put a noose inside of Bubba Wallace's garage stall over the weekend.
A noose was found in driver Bubba Wallace's garage yesterday at Talladega.
Obviously, I was hurt. I was sad that people would go to those measures.
NASCAR, they say they're outraged about what happened, determined to find out who did this, and they just want to eliminate them from the sport.
The incident comes less than 2 weeks after NASCAR announced it would ban Confederate flags from all events after Bubba Wallace himself called for that change.
This just shows just how much I have to watch my back.
A federal investigation has been launched into the noose that was found in NASCAR star Bubba Wallace's garage stall.
It's all in their hands now, the FBI's hands, to go through everything and try to figure it out.
We begin tonight with breaking news from NASCAR just moments ago, saying the FBI investigation into the noose found in the garage of NASCAR driver Bubba Wallace was no crime, they say.
The FBI says the noose found in Bubba Wallace's garage at Talladega Speedway was a garage pull.
That is just a loop that pulled the door down.
In the end, they determined that the rope that was found in Bubba Wallace's garage had actually been there long before that garage was actually assigned to Bubba Wallace.
It was a noose. It was a noose that was whether tied in 2019 or whatever. It was a noose.
Okay, to be clear then, this entire story unfolded over 3 days. On Sunday, Bubba's team found the rope. On Monday, NASCAR called in the feds, and by Tuesday, the FBI concluded that no crime had been committed. Okay, let's bring in our guest now, and over in New York, we have Bob Pockrass. He is a journalist who's been covering NASCAR for over 20 years. In California, we have Jesse Iwuji, a driver in NASCAR's Truck Series. And in Kentucky, we have Wilfred Riley, an academic and author of the book, Hate Crime Hoax. Let's go to Bob first. Bob, it's easy to say that NASCAR and Bubba Wallace jumped to conclusions here, but of course it is a particularly tense time, not only for the sport, but also for the country. That might explain it.
Absolutely, it's a tense time. Ever since the George Floyd murder in Minneapolis in May, there's been heightened tensions and heightened awareness on racial inequality, and the NASCAR drivers and the NASCAR president came out and said that they need to change, that the country needs to change. And so when Bubba Wallace advocated for the ban of the Confederate flag, and then NASCAR went through with that ban, there was there's certainly some hate on social media toward Bubba Wallace, and there were people who were concerned about his safety. Bubba said his father had texted him and said, should you be going out in the infield like you used to do, where you just jump in a golf cart and go and meet fans? Do you need some security? Do you need to bring people with you? So there was that concern going into Talladega. Even though there were not fans there, there was still absolutely that concern about Bubba Wallace and for his safety.
And just explain why Bubba's campaign to have the Confederate flag removed from NASCAR was so contentious.
Well, it's been something that NASCAR has been moving toward over the last 5 to 10 years. 5 years ago, NASCAR implemented a policy where they would trade people who had a Confederate flag. If they wanted, NASCAR would give them a U.S. flag or a driver flag in exchange for the Confederate flag. And the result was tracks being left with boxes of United States flags. No one was willing to trade them. The feeling that that flag represents, the Southern United States heritage and is a sense of pride for some people in the South. They did not want to trade. They feel like they are giving up part of their heritage.
Right, and you were saying the flag to some represents Southern pride, and to others it represents the bad old days of slavery and so on. Jesse, I'd like to come to you. You work for NASCAR. Some will say that NASCAR should really have kept the whole thing quiet until law enforcement, i.e. the FBI in this case, could investigate and determine whether or not it was actually a hate crime.
Yeah, some could, potentially argue that and say that, maybe they should have kept it quiet until they figured out all the facts and tried to figure out, but at the end of the day, with everything going on right now in the country, right now people are doing less of being silent and doing more of being vocal. If we see something that could potentially be, racist or something like that, I think nowadays people are now more calling it out as soon as they see it. I made a comparison the other day, and some people didn't really like this comparison, but, I'm still making it. Back after 9/11, in the U.S., there's a really big heightened sense of security through all the airports. So any little thing would cause, something like this to happen. So let's say if you left a backpack at the airport sitting somewhere randomly, they would literally shut the whole airport down, ground all the planes, bring in the bomb squad, bring in, the media and all that stuff. And then, they'd finally get to the backpack and find out that, hey, this bag, there's nothing in it. There's no bomb. There's no nothing. And then everything was fine. But no one would ever blame the airport for making it a big deal.
Well, that's a very good point, Jesse. But if we were to take your example a step further, you might say that the airport wouldn't go as far as to call it a terrorist act. They might say it's a suspicious package, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. So yeah, NASCAR did, originally, mention, things that, hey, it might be a hate crime or something like that. True. And I would say everyone looking back on it now, we probably would have gone about it in a little bit different way. But, at the end of the day, there's just so much going on in the country right now. These are, I wouldn't say these are new times because, different acts and hateful acts have happened over the course of time for many, many years, and a lot more, 30, 40, 50 years ago. I think 2020 definitely we're in a better spot than we were in 1950s and the 1960s, but we still have a lot to, to change and a lot to, really, fix in this country.
Let's bring in Wilfred. As Jesse was saying, it's a very febrile environment in the United States right now. But what are the dangers of that?
I think the dangers, some of which we saw even after 9/11, are extreme overreaction. So speaking practically here, I think my strong suspicion from the beginning was that this Bubba Wallace incident had not happened, at least as a hate crime. You're talking about a situation right now for NASCAR where there are no fans on the track because of the COVID-19 pandemic. You're talking about a situation where these $1 million cars are monitored constantly, I would assume. In fact, I know by very high-end in-house camera systems. It seemed that it would be the work of minutes to find out whether or not someone had snuck in and planted a noose in Mr. Wallace's garage. It turned out this did not happen, and this joins a fairly long list of these incidents. Obviously, Jussie Smollett is the first that comes to mind. But also you could easily throw Covington Catholic on that list. Erika Thomas, the congresswoman that claimed she suffered a brutal, at least verbal, racial attack in the store. the alleged DC dreadlock cutting case. I mean, there was a situation in Oakland also just days ago where the claim was made that in a middle-class, mostly black neighborhood, a collection of, I believe, 5 nooses had been found in a public park. And it turned out that an African-American gentleman came forward and said, no, we obviously don't have this problem here. I put these up as exercise equipment. Despite this claim, the mayor, as I understand, is still investigating this as a hate crime. One of my goals with my research is to look at the actual facts behind some of these panics around race and violence and other things that we see in the USA and globally are. In terms of the claim that these are totally new times, that race relations are at a low, one thing I would say is that many claims of, for example, Black Lives Matter don't seem empirically to be true. If you look at the Washington Post police shootings database, for example, the total number of unarmed African Americans that were killed by police last year in 2019 was in fact 15. Violent interracial crime between blacks and whites is roughly 5% of crime. And I will say that's not majority white on black. So when we actually unpack some of these things, I think the reaction to the Bubba Wallace claim was everything you really could have wanted it to be, with the drivers of NASCAR marching in solidarity with Mr. Wallace and so on. But the background context here is that very, very, very often these claims turn out not to be true, and that there is no intense, extraordinary racial conflict in the USA.
Bob, as a journalist yourself, what did you make of news networks just running the story of a hate crime, essentially, not an alleged hate crime, before and without waiting for the FBI to do its work?
Well, the situation with COVID-19 is that journalists aren't allowed inside the garage. There's a couple of broadcasters from both TV and radio, but beyond that, that's it. So our ability to do independent investigating is extremely limited. To do a lot of talking to people about what was going on in the garage that day is extremely limited. So in some ways we had to take NASCAR at their word, and right. You know, it didn't necessarily benefit NASCAR to say that it was a heinous act before they knew what was going on, because in many ways they were pointing the finger at someone within their industry. As you know, fans were not allowed in that area. The only people allowed in that area were teams, drivers, and crews.
Bob, just to go back to journalists doing their homework before they jump on the bandwagon, you yourself took a look through your phone, and what did you see?
Well, I took a look through my phone after we got the results of the FBI investigation, and I was going through my videos from last year in October at Talladega, and I did see the garage rope formed like a noose in the background of one of my videos.
And that was well before the garage was assigned to Bubba Wallace, right? So that
if I could interject here just very briefly, one thing I will say is that in terms of journalists doing their homework, there were a number of sources on the internet. I mean, as I recall, the blog Conservative Treehouse did this. I think it was Cop Block, one of the edgier sites on the left, did this, where people obtained footage of these NASCAR garages over periods of time, a couple of weeks ago, a couple of months ago, and essentially found this rope that was alleged to be a noose. I do think that we can say that the media should perhaps have fact-checked this a little bit more. Is there footage available? Are there images of that garage, that stall available? And as it turns out, there were. And people were able to see them. And this, again, happened with Covington Catholic. This happened with Jussie Smollett. People were able to see the area where this occurred in real time as the discussion of the hate crime incident was ongoing.
Wilfred, when journalists and indeed NASCAR could condemn this as a heinous act, you know, before the FBI could do its job, they're also implicitly condemning a group of people, aren't they? Namely the poor, white, rural people. And in fact, we have an example from ESPN's Ryan McGee titled, "A Note to Racing's Racists. You Scared No One, Least of All Bubba Wallace." And he goes on to describe such people as rednecks. Wilfred, when journalists think that there is no downside to jumping to conclusions and making sort of stereotypical judgments about people, it does do damage, doesn't it?
Yes, I think it definitely does. I mean, obviously, when the media, I think the media has a tendency to promote panics along many lines, by the way. This is a nonpartisan point. This goes across young child kidnapping. This goes across the extreme focus on both black on white crime and white on black crime. This goes even to plane crashes, animal attacks. And obviously, when you see this, what you see is a boosting, a proliferation of this culture of fear that we have in the United States. And yes, of course, groups of people are often the victims of that. I mean, we've all heard, I come from a big city, I'm from Chicago. We've all heard the jokes about NASCAR fans. I mean, people drinking beer in the infield of the racetrack and so on. And obviously, if you say, well, someone who's a Confederate supporter put a literal hangman's noose in the stall of the best black driver, I mean, that's good. Not to say the only, that's going to boost this impression of that fan base and of that region of the country. And I think it absolutely does matter whether or not this is true. African Americans and Caucasians may have our conflicts in the South to some extent, but when you look at some of these stories like the Bubba Wallace story, although I'm not comparing these two men at all, the Jussie Smollett story, the impression that there are, for example, groups of people wandering around with nooses starting racial fights, that is not real in the United States. So presenting that image absolutely does worsen tensions between the races. It does increase stereotyping of, say, poor whites and so on down the line. It was a very strong negative effect. This is true for all false reports, by the way.
Jesse, tell us about your experience driving for NASCAR, and what further changes would you like to see?
For me, my experience has, for the most part, been positive. Honestly, I've never experienced any racism at the track by anybody to my face. Now, you know, when you start going onto social media and stuff, I have experienced some racism on social media. I've had people, you know, make different jokes about me, you know, take my picture and write the N-word all the way across it. Things like that. Stuff like that usually will happen 1 to 3 times a year, you know, over the last few years. And, you know, I see it. And at the end of the day, it's just trolls just trying to, you know, get you off your game. And you know what? That's fine. You know, at the end of the day, I'm still in the United States military myself as a reservist. I still serve, you know, every single year. And, you know, I protect the freedoms of everyone in this country to be able to speak freely. And sometimes I'm protecting the freedoms of people who are great, and sometimes I'm protecting the freedoms of people who don't have some great things to say. So, but you know what? That's what I support and defend is the Constitution of the United States of America. So I support and defend everyone's freedom of speech, and I'll keep on doing that for as long as I can.
Now, some commentators, as you alluded to earlier in the program, have compared Bubba Wallace to Jussie Smollett, the black actor who alleged he suffered a racial attack last year. But there is a big difference, isn't there? I mean, while Bubba Wallace and indeed NASCAR appear to have made a genuine mistake by jumping to conclusions, Jussie Smollett actually went so far as to apparently stage a hate crime against himself.
This is the moment that Jussie Smollett tells Chicago police he's just been attacked by 2 white men wearing masks who put a noose around his neck. Less than a month later, Smollett revealed all in this exclusive interview.
The attacker masked, and he said, "This MAGA country punches me right in the face." Then I look down and I see that there's a rope around my neck.
The rest of the mainstream media uncritically ate it up.
This is horrible to report. And this is America in 2019.
Democrat politicians were also keen to believe a hate crime had been committed by MAGA supporters, including the frontrunner to become Joe Biden's vice president, Kamala Harris, who called it a modern-day lynching. But not everyone was convinced. A conservative corner of the internet erupted.
The hate crime hoax that he himself orchestrated.
So-called hate crime, which was really a hoax.
No freaking way.
And it turns out they were right to be suspicious. Video and other evidence emerged indicating that Smollett had set the whole thing up, allegedly paying 2 Nigerian men to stage an attack on him. The Osundaro brothers, who worked as extras on his TV show, confessed. Chicago police were dismayed.
An African-American man used the symbolism of a noose to make false accusations. My concern is that hate crimes will now publicly be met with a level of skepticism that previously didn't happen.
Smollett was charged with numerous offences, including filing a fake police report. But all charges were dropped when his expensive legal team reached a deal with prosecutors that would see Smollett do just 16 hours of community service. Many were outraged.
This is without a doubt a whitewash of justice.
But Smollett's not off the hook yet. In February this year, a special prosecutor secured more charges against him, including disorderly conduct. Smollett maintains he's innocent, but it will be for a court to decide.
Wilfred, let me come to you first. You've written a book called Hate Crime Hoax. Just how common are hoaxes?
They're fairly common. The max estimate I gave in the book was about 15% of hate crime allegations. So, I mean, let's upfront say that I don't think anyone thinks that the typical mundane hate crime allegation where someone alleges that they were beaten outside a cowboy bar or a tough black club at closing time, no one thinks that's a fake. But among these high-profile cases with these cinematic characteristics, much of the University of Missouri scandal, I've listed a number already, the Ku Klux Klan spotted at Oberlin, many cases involving nooses, an archaic symbol like the University of Wisconsin Parkside. Very many of these do turn out not to be true. And I think to some extent there's a positive factor underlying that, which is that the demand for bigots in the USA on the part of the activist left often exceeds the supply. There very, very, very often are not actually people wandering around pleasant, mid-sized southern cities putting up nooses in the trees. So when someone says that such a thing happened, it may often not be real.
So what advantage are people looking for when they make such an allegation?
Well, a number of things. I mean, to some extent, people could be motivated by the ordinary forces driving most crime, insurance money, for example, if a bar burns to the ground. But we also have to understand that victimization, to some extent, has a value. When you see a number of these cases on college campuses, including Missouri, you don't see a hostile backlash from the student body. You see a parade through campus. You see major changes made to social policy. That's one thing I want to note here. If you want to drive something like the adoption of diversity training or support for Black Lives Matter through an industry, you could do worse than to have one of these incidents happen. Now, I will say Bubba Wallace and Jussie Smollett are not comparable. Bubba Wallace did not fake this incident, but I do think there were people that jumped on it immediately and said, look, here it is again. And I think banteringly from the perspective of my book title, I too could say, look, here it is again.
Look, we've talked about journalists, what their motivations might be. What about politicians? Why do politicians, who are supposed to be the grown-ups in the room, they're supposed to be leading the country, why do they jump to conclusions before it's gone through law enforcement?
I think, again, if that's for me, you have many of the same motivations there. I definitely think, and this is obviously true on the hard right. It's obviously true on the left. One of the most atavistic motivations a group of people can have is warriors of the other race are coming for me. I recall in the 2012 presidential election involving Mitt Romney, who's sort of a milquetoast corporate executive, mainstream Republican. One of Vice President Joe Biden's claims against him was that he was going to bring back slavery, at least metaphorically. He's going to put y'all back in chains. If you can get people to believe that sort of thing before an election, it doesn't hurt your chances.
Bob, but do you think standards in American journalism have declined over the years? It's just that, it used to be the importance attached to saying words like alleged, interviewing witnesses, visiting the scene, which I know is difficult in this particular instance. But is it something to do with the 24-hour news cycle, feeding that beast, and the fierce competition now from so many different sources and people just on social media?
Absolutely. And there is, journalism obviously has changed in the sense of that now people get their facts, through social media or through, and through watching TV and reading newspapers, but they also expect analysis. They expect a little bit more of an opinion or a little bit more of an attitude because the facts are typically fairly well known or before you turn on the TV. You can get those facts typically from social media.
Wilfred, we're coming towards the end of the show. This story about Bubba Wallace is just one thread, if you like, in the chaotic tapestry of the United States right now. Is this a time for people, politicians and journalists and campaigners and protesters to put the brakes on, to just step back for a minute and take a look at what all this screaming and shouting is doing to the country?
Yes, as read the last comment, I really respected that journalistic perspective, but I think this is more of a time than ever before for facts and data. I mean, if you look at social media, Facebook, Twitter, 4chan, Reddit, I mean, these sites often do attempt to break news stories, but they're generally hilariously wrong. And I think that there is a major role for the legacy press in coming out there and saying, right now we don't know, please calm down, this is what we are aware of. And I will say, when I mentioned earlier in the show that the total number of unarmed African Americans killed by police in 2019 was 15, I'll add the total number of unarmed individuals, including the Caucasian and Hispanic majority, was around 60. And I don't think that too many people know that. Very often, what we seem to get from the press is a more professionalized, more left-leaning version of the same edgy, witty commentary we're getting from our friends on Twitter and Reddit. And I don't think that's ideal. I think we all do need to pause, step on the brakes for a bit, and try to find out to what extent the things that are being said by provocative players, from Mr. Trump on the one side to Democratic leadership on the other to activists in the streets, are actually real. And very often they are not actually real, which is a problem.
Well, that's all we have time for this week. Wilfred Riley, Bob Pokras, and Jesse Iwuji, thank you all very much for your contributions to the Nexus, and thank you at home for watching. Remember, you can see this episode and all our previous episodes on our channel on YouTube. Just type in TRT World and Nexus, and it should come up. Until next week, then, goodbye.